Hello everybody, this is Brandon with the Whatcast, Warhammer Underworlds Tactics. Welcome to part 1 of the Whatcast's Get Good series, how to build a competitive deck. So here's the basic process, which we'll go into depth on throughout this video. I'll be the first to admit this isn't going to be very visually interesting, but I am hoping that this format helps to get across what is a very cerebral process. First, you're going to define a win condition. Then you're going to pick a faction, designate your objective cards, then your ploy cards, and finally your upgrades. Then you're going to playtest the deck repeatedly, and finally refine the deck. Before you even pick a faction, you should take a moment to define what the win condition is of your deck. This is a common concept in many collectible and living card games like Hearthstone or Magic or many of Fantasy Flight's games. But the idea is you need to decide on a broad strategy that is a general game plan before you do anything. In essence, your plan needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which conveniently works out to the 3 turns in any Shadespire game. In theory, if you follow this game plan and don't allow your opponent or the dice to disrupt it too much, you're going to win. You'll also want to increase the odds of that actually happening by avoiding disruption and adapting to unavoidable disruption. However, keep in mind that there is going to be disruption, and in order to reach top-level play, you've got to be resistant and adaptive to it. So this strategy can be as simple as kill everything, or control objectives, or it can be as complicated as accomplish a specific third turn objective. You can even get more specific, such as I want to overwhelm my opponent with too many threats. Your next choice is whether you want to go with a single strategy and synergize all your cards around that, or you can choose to have multiple viable paths to victory. Let's look at the benefits of full commitment to a single strategy. This plan enables you to focus all of your card choices and tactical choices towards that single goal, ensuring that all of your tactics are synergized towards that goal. Because you can devote multiple resources to accomplishing a single goal, this reduces the possibility of having random elements such as dice or your available cards impacting your overall strategy. In addition, because all of your resources can do the same job, you can devote extra resources to accomplishing a task when other resources fail, which they will. Finally, this is a lot easier to grasp and put into practice as a newer player. However, this approach is not without its pitfalls. Your opponent is eventually going to notice that you're working towards the same goal in every activation. This gets even worse in a best-of-3 format, which most tournaments are being played at. In addition, your one plan becomes easy to counter as your opponent knows they just need to stop you from doing that one thing. This becomes problematic because if you can't succeed by doing your one thing, you can't do much of anything else. The trend here is that a canny player who has some idea of the meta is going to know how to counter your plays and probably came expecting to have to deal with your specific strategy. In a meta where you have a lot of experienced players who might be wise to your shenaniganry, this is going to be crippling. On the other hand, you can take a more versatile approach. Here are the benefits. Because you have multiple ways to win, you can adapt to an opponent having a strong defense against any given tactic. For instance, if you're playing Blood Reavers, and your efforts to kill everything are stymied by Stormcast with heavy defense, you can simply switch towards an objective grabbing strategy. Also, because you have a variety of different objectives, you can build momentum with consistent early game glory that's easy to pick up. Finally, your opponent is going to have more difficulty predicting and countering your movements. Ideally, this presents your opponent with much more difficult choices and more opportunities for them to make a poor decision that you can capitalize on. For example, in our Stormcast example, if you were to switch to an objective focus and your opponent spreads out to try to chase you down, you can switch plans again and then swarm isolated fighters. Of course, this has its own drawbacks. Being a jack of all trades inevitably leads to being a master of none. Without the benefits of overkill towards any one tactic, you might find that you're not really strong enough at doing any of those things to compete. To return to our previous example, you could end up spending most of your activations maneuvering, only to have Targor whiff against Brightshield, and then she disdainfully beats him to death. Also, while you might be generating a few glory points each turn, you may find that your total possible glory is much lower than in a focused deck. You'll probably find that most of your objectives are only worth 1 glory, maybe 2, and against a high-scoring deck that you didn't sufficiently counter, you're not going to be able to keep up. Finally, this is going to take a lot more out of a player in terms of knowledge and mental balancing. Newer players may end up confusing themselves and dropping one of the many plates that they're spinning. Ultimately, like most other things in this game, this is a question of risk versus reward. Focusing on a single strategy is riskier, but it offers a larger potential reward. Having multiple strategies is less risky, but you won't have massive stacks of glory at the end of the game. So how should you choose between these options? The questions you have to answer for yourself are: which playstyle do I enjoy more? Can I mitigate the risk of a single strategy or the lower reward of multiple strategies with my faction and deck? Now that you have a general game plan in place, it's time to pick a faction to accomplish that plan. First question is, which faction does this best? For example, Fyreslayers have high damage output, particularly on Fuel Grimnir, making aggressive strategies very well suited to them. However, don't forget that there's more to the factions than the stats on each character card. Upgrades and ploys can dramatically shift your faction's abilities towards a number of possible goals. For example, you can gear Skaven specifically towards a more violent build, or if you're playing Ironjaws, you can increase your damage output with their unique ploys. Unfortunately, using ploys and upgrades to work around your faction's weaknesses reduces your available card slots to actually accomplish your goals and other things that you want to do. In a game with such tight margins like Shadespire, this can be extremely difficult. Some factions just can't do certain things. In the future, we'll have a series of videos taking a deep dive into the pros and cons of each faction, as well as the opportunities you'll have to minimize or maximize pros and minimize cons. But for now, just visualize how you'll accomplish your strategy with this faction and ask yourself if another faction would do it better. Now that our general philosophy is out of the way, let's actually pick out some cards, and we'll start with objectives. Grab all of them. Don't be picky here. Just go through all of your objectives, every last one. Grab anything that might be feasible to use towards your defined strategy. We're going to narrow them down very quickly later, but we need to know all of our options. While you're piling up objectives, it's a good idea to go ahead and separate them out into 4 or 5 or whatever general piles based on what kind of objective they are. And this is going to be important later. Your mileage may vary based on your playstyle, faction, and strategy, but I like to break them down into the following categories. Score immediately. Any objective that can be scored immediately, such as Crushing Force. These can be quickly cycled through in the early game, but they also serve the purpose of theoretically shrinking your objective deck. Plus, they can get your momentum moving faster by providing glory before the first end phase. If your strategy is to control the tempo of the game, this can be very helpful in establishing early game pressure. We'll have a video in the future on controlling tempo. Third end phase, or 3EP. These are objectives such as conquest or denial. I like to use these as knockout blows. Typically, they're going to be worth a lot of glory, but they're dangerous if you get too many of them in the early hands because you literally can't do anything with them. Easy objectives. These are objectives that are easy to score in any given turn, such as playing a standard or any of the 5 hold objective cards. This is going to keep you at pace in the early and middle games. And finally, hard objectives like supremacy or making a statement. These are cards that require careful play and a lot of moving parts to accomplish, but they pay off in large amounts of glory. Now that we've sorted the cards out into individual categories, now is a good time to figure out how many of each type of card you want in your deck. You'll have exactly 12 to divide amongst whatever categories you've created. Here's a sample that I sometimes use, but deciding this is up to you and what you think works for your strategy, faction, and playstyle. I like having only 1/3 end phase card. I have a lower chance of pulling it in the first couple of turns, and if I do, it's not that much of a dead weight. Here I'm going with 2 hard objectives, with the idea that I'm minimizing the risk of a no-glory turn, but I'm also giving my option for a big win in the final turn. I'll typically pile up a lot of easy objectives to maintain consistent gain in the early game so that I can apply a lot of upgrades. And finally, I go with 4 score immediately cards. Most of these score immediately cards, in the current meta at least, and at the time of recording this video, the Skaven and Fyreslayers have just come out, and the Farsighters and Magor's Fiends have just been announced. Anyway, the score immediately cards currently are generally based around some form of violence. And as I almost always play aggressive decks, this lets me force a fast tempo. Overall, this spread ensures that you're likely to have strong early game glory generation, while having the option for a knockout blow in the end game. It's appropriate for a versatile strategy, and if I were going with a single strategy build, I'd probably add a few more hard objectives at the cost of the easy ones. Now that we've defined a number of slots for our deck, it becomes less intimidating to tackle the wealth of cards in front of you because you've divided the large problem into some manageable chunks. Now you just need to go through each category and the pile of possible cards that goes with it, deciding on the best X cards, where X is the number of slots in that category. What makes a card best in slot, to borrow some MMO parlance, is going to be whatever works best for your strategy, playstyle, and faction. Let's use 3rd end phase cards as an example. So let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm playing an aggressive Skaven deck that wants to use superior movement speed and applied violence to control my half of the board. Your 3rd end phase cards represent your final goal, so we need to pick something that definitely functions as a goal, works with our faction, and fits with our strategy. Here's every possible card that fits in that slot in the current card library. We have 9 possible cards, and we only need to pick 1. Our first step should be to eliminate those that don't serve the purpose we're going for. First off, 3rd end phase cards carry a lot of inherent risk because they're 3rd end phase cards. And for that to be worth it, we need a substantial reward. That means that any of these that are only worth 1 glory point simply aren't fit for purpose. Ergo, we can immediately eliminate Leading from the Back and Numberless Swarm. We also have plenty of options here that give us at least 3 glory. Based on that, I'd personally want to eliminate the 2 glory point cards, Live to Fight Another Day and Conquest. Now we're left with only 5 options. I'm playing Skaven, so while I stand a good chance of killing a few enemies, as that is one of the goals of my deck, I doubt that I have the raw offensive power to kill every last enemy model. If I wanted to do that, I'd play Garruk's Reavers. So as a result, I can safely declare Annihilation not fit for purpose. While I'm on that train of thought, I also don't think I have much of a chance of taking out 5 whole enemy fighters, especially considering that's literally impossible against half of the factions in the game. We can swipe left on Endless Slaughter. We're left with 3 very good options. I like Superior Tactician, but because I've got 5 easy objectives and 4 score immediately ones. But that's not the stated purpose of my deck, and that's not what I'm devoting most of my resources to. Superior Tactician goes back in the box. That just leaves a choice between Denial and Contained in one slot to put them in. Both return the same glory value, but a careful analysis of the wording makes Denial slightly easier to pull off. You just need no enemy fighters in your territory, whereas Contained requires enemy fighters to be specifically in theirs, as in not in no man's land. That means Contained gets contained in the card box, and Denial is our grand champion. So after going through that process, we now have our only 3 EP slot filled. Now, we just need to repeat that process for each of our other categories. In the interest of running time, I won't repeat the example, as the purpose of this video is not how I built this questionably effective Skaven deck, but how you build your undeniably effective whatever deck. The key is apply the same logic, or the same process of logic rather, to each choice. Alright, now for Ploys. We're going through the exact same process again. You're going to need a big fistful of universal Ploys, as well as those unique to your faction. Just go ahead and grab all of them. Ploys do different things, so we have different categories. The ones I like to use are Movement Shenanigans. Anything that increases your speed, pushes your fighters or your opponent's fighters, or otherwise modifies the board state by moving figures. For example, Sidestep. Counters. Any ploy that is meant to disrupt whatever your opponent is doing, either by weakening one of their fighters, preventing a ploy from happening, or forcing your opponent's choice in a turn. Offense buffs. Anything that either causes your fighters to do more damage, or have a greater chance to do damage, or anything that otherwise deals direct damage to an enemy fighter. Defense buffs are anything that actively prevent damage or death to your fighters, or restore wounds. Finally, other cards are anything that generates glory, or anything that doesn't readily fit in any other category. Interestingly, these usually have such a large strategic effect that it's worth considering these cards individually before you decide how many other slots you want to allot. For example, if I decide right off the bat I definitely want Earthquake in my deck to deal with my existing meta, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have at least one other slot before I make that ratio decision. Just like with objectives, we're going to decide on a ratio for our ploy cards. This time it is slightly more complex because you have to consider that upgrades will have a similar set of categories and there's going to be some overlap. Upgrades generally fall into offense, defense, and movement, so I tend to rely less on ploys for those purposes. I haven't personally been convinced that having any more than 10 cards is a good idea, but there are a lot of smart people that disagree with me, so your mileage may vary. That being said, I would say that if you're a newer player, sticking to 10 cards is probably going to be easier to deal with until you learn ways to cycle through cards more quickly. My example configuration is 3 movement shenanigans, 3 counters, 2 defense buffs, 1 offense buff, and 1 other, which in the current meta usually tends to be Earthquake. This configuration allows me a high degree of interactivity with my opponent's strategy. It gives me 2 cards to short my defenses if I have a critical character with wounds on them, and it gives me a decent chance at an unexpected one-shot kill to change the board state. Just like before, once you've decided on the number of each type of ploy you have, Now you just need to select the best for each slot. Each card that goes into each one of these slots is generally going to have varying levels of effect for versatility. That is, a card that is useful in a lot of theoretical situations is going to have a smaller impact than a card that is useful in fewer situations. Again, this is a question of risk versus reward. Finally, we're going to repeat the same process with upgrade cards. For the most part, upgrades come in the same categories as ploys, but can have a greater effect due to multiple turn effectiveness in return for requiring a glory point expenditure. That being said, I personally feel that the best use for upgrades is to think of them purely in relation to who you're going to put them on. For example, adding a weapon to one of your chaff units suddenly makes that unit a threat when they weren't before. Since I personally like to play very aggressively, I tend to favor offensive buffs and weapons. This may not work with your strategy or playstyle, but here's a ratio that I usually run with. This setup leaves counters to my ploys, but it allows me to crank up the offense. And that's a completed deck. But you're not done. What you have now is a theoretical deck. Now, you need to get out there and play with it, and I believe this is the absolute most important part of the process. A generalized method like this is not going to get you a winning deck. It's going to get you a good starting point. Play the deck as many times as you can, and with a large variety of opponents. Pay attention to how your deck fails and succeeds in each game, and from there, tweak it. Maybe all those offensive buffs didn't really pay off. Maybe the cards you chose for each category aren't really effective, or they're hard to deploy. Go out and break it so that you can fix it. Now that you've tested the deck, lay out all the cards of each type: objective, upgrade, ploy. Take a long, hard look at each one. In the games that you played, did any of them consistently fail you? Did any get frequently discarded? Set those cards aside and see if you have any other cards that might be better placed in that slot based on your play experience. Over time and repetition, this is going to shore up your deck's weaknesses and refine it towards accomplishing your core strategy. Keep playing the deck and keep tweaking it. Not only does this let you further refine the deck, it also means that you will know the deck better from top to bottom card. Knowing what's in the deck before you draw any cards is critical in any card game, and it helps you assess the odds and options you have in the next couple activations, as well as what your opponent is doing. This allows you to sort of count cards based on what you have in your hand, what you've drawn, how many cards are left in the deck, and what you see in your discard pile. And that's the whole process. I hope you found this helpful. As I said before, this is a very formulaic approach to deck building that I find works for me. Please feel free to add your own deck building strategies in the comments, and also please like, share, and subscribe in order to help us produce more content. Until next time, good luck and have fun.